My name is Claire Thompson, and at 32 years old, I never expected that my own birthday celebration would become the night my world cracked open. What should have been a simple gathering to honor another year of my life turned into a public unraveling, a stage where my sister stripped me bare in front of everyone I loved. It was the kind of moment that silences a room and steals the air from your lungs. The memory still lingers in sharp fragments. The cake glowing with candles, the sound of voices joining in a familiar melody, the warmth of laughter wrapping the walls of the house, and then her words. The revelation I had worked so hard to keep buried was thrown into the open with a smile that disguised cruelty. I stood motionless, unable to stop the whispers that immediately swelled around me. My secret, my greatest shame, was no longer mine. It belonged to the crowd. But what no one knew, what she never suspected, was that I held something of hers too. A secret she had hidden beneath layers of charm and confidence. A truth that, unlike mine, was preserved in sound, recorded, undeniable, and waiting for its moment. That night, while I was meant to be destroyed, the balance of power quietly shifted into my hands. Before I take you through that night, I need to step back, to explain how I came to live in the shadow of my sister, how betrayal had been stitched into our family fabric long before adulthood, and why the moment she thought she had broken me was the same moment she unraveled herself. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, in a neighborhood where image mattered more than truth. Our family looked polished from the outside, with a home that suggested comfort and stability. But inside, attention and love were rationed unevenly. Emily, my sister, had been born with the kind of glow that people noticed. She was vibrant, beautiful, magnetic, the child who made teachers beam and relatives gush. I was steady, quiet, often described as the responsible one, but rarely celebrated for it. From early on, the contrast was clear. At dinner tables, stories of Emily's achievements flowed effortlessly. The trophies, the invitations, the endless admiration she collected. I sat beside her with straight A's and awards of my own that barely drew mention. My identity became invisibility, a silent role that kept the peace in exchange for my presence being overlooked. Yet silence is not emptiness. Beneath it, I carried an inner world of words and reflections that became my refuge. Journals filled with thoughts no one asked to hear. A hidden passion for writing, learning, and creating meaning in spaces where I felt unseen. While Emily performed for the world, I quietly built myself in shadows, though no one seemed to notice. Over time, she learned that her beauty and charisma could bend rules. She lied easily, manipulated circumstances, and somehow always landed on her feet. I, on the other hand, carried my pain inward. My secret was different, heavy, and born from an experience that left me fractured. I never asked for it. I never wanted it. But it marked me in ways I spent years trying to hide. That shame became a part of me, locked tightly away from even the people closest to me. The older we grew, the more the imbalance deepened. Emily's recklessness was dismissed as charm. My quietness was interpreted as weakness. I tried to carve my own life beyond the family's gaze, through education, through work, through independence. Yet the weight of comparison followed me everywhere. By the time I reached my 30s, I had grown used to the quiet ache of being measured against her glow. And then came my birthday. The one evening that was supposed to be mine, the one tradition where the attention would fall on me, if only briefly. Instead, it became the moment she claimed center stage once again. Not with her light, but with the destruction of mine. What she didn't realize, what no one in that room expected, was that I had stopped being defenseless long ago. Her words exposed me, yes, but they also unlocked something else. The truth I had been waiting to release. A truth that would change everything. I often look back on my childhood in Madison, Wisconsin, not with nostalgia, but with the sharp clarity of someone who finally understands the roots of her own silence. To outsiders, we looked like the perfect middle-class family. Our house sat neatly on a quiet street, the lawn trimmed just right, the windows polished to reflect a home filled with warmth. But perfection has a way of disguising wounds, and within those walls, mine were carved early. Emily and I were close in age, just 2 years apart, but worlds separated us from the very beginning. She had the kind of beauty and energy that demanded attention. Her golden hair, her easy smile, her effortless charm, they made her the child everyone noticed. My parents, neighbors, teachers, relatives, all of them seemed captivated by her presence. She didn't need to try. The spotlight followed her naturally, as though she had been born with a magnet for affection. And then there was me. Quiet, studious, reliable. I excelled in school, loved books, and preferred the safety of my own imagination over the noise of crowds. But those qualities rarely drew recognition. At family gatherings, I was the one setting the table, cleaning up, helping where I could, while Emily dazzled everyone with a story or a performance. My contributions were invisible, not because they lacked value, but because they lacked spectacle. In those early years, I learned that love in our household was not evenly distributed. Praise flowed toward Emily like a river, steady and unending. My accomplishments, though steady and significant, were acknowledged briefly, if at all. The imbalance was so subtle at first that I barely recognized it, but children absorb more than words. I felt it in the way conversations bent toward her, in the glances of pride reserved for her triumphs, in the long silences that followed my own achievements. Comparison became the unspoken language of our family. If Emily was the star, I was the shadow. If she was celebrated, I was tolerated. This dynamic seeped into my bones, shaping how I saw myself and the world around me. I began to believe invisibility was my role, a quiet background figure existing only to make her glow brighter. But while she basked in constant admiration, Emily learned to wield it like a weapon. Her charm was not just natural, it was strategic. She discovered early that tears or smiles could bend situations in her favor, that rules were flexible when she broke them, that others would cover for her simply because they wanted to keep seeing her shine. I watched it all unfold, silently absorbing the unfairness, silently wishing I could matter in the same way. Meanwhile, I built an inner world no one else could touch. Journals filled with words became my closest companions. I wrote about everything, my disappointments, my dreams, my loneliness. Writing became a lifeline, a way to carve meaning when I felt unseen. It also became my shield, a private reminder that even if the outside world ignored me, I could still define myself on paper. Still, the wounds accumulated. Small moments that should have been insignificant cut deeper when repeated endlessly. Emily would win a cheerleading trophy, and my parents would beam with pride, displaying it on the mantel. I would bring home a perfect report card, and it would end up tucked in a drawer, quickly forgotten. Emily would host a group of friends, filling the house with laughter, and I would be expected to stay quiet, to make room. These patterns shaped me long before I could name them, teaching me that my value was conditional, my voice unnecessary. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us felt unbridgeable. Emily thrived in the world of attention. Dating, parties, endless compliments. I withdrew further into academics, books, and the safety of solitude. I excelled in ways that went unnoticed. Advanced classes, awards, opportunities that hinted at a promising future. But none of it seemed to matter at home. My parents' focus stayed fixed on Emily, as if her light was the only one worth acknowledging. This imbalance did more than just shape my self-esteem. It deepened the quiet rivalry between us. I wanted to be close to her, to have the kind of sisterly bond I saw in other families, but her dominance left no room for me. When she looked at me, it wasn't with love or kinship, but with the smug satisfaction of someone who knew she had already won a game I wasn't even allowed to play. And yet, beneath all of this, there was another truth I carried. My secret. A private wound that went far deeper than sibling rivalry. Something that scarred me long before my 30th birthday. Something I never told a soul. It was the reason I shrank in certain moments. The reason my journals, sometimes filled with words I could barely bring myself to read again. Unlike Emily's polished surface, my life carried cracks that I worked tirelessly to cover. This was the foundation of our story, a family where attention was currency, where I grew up starved of recognition, and where Emily thrived unchecked. These early years didn't just shape who we became as adults, they set the stage for the night she thought she could destroy me. She believed I would always be powerless, always invisible, always the one too fragile to withstand her cruelty. She was wrong, because while she lived for the spotlight, I had been quietly collecting truths in the shadows, and one of those truths, hers, would one day shift everything. Adulthood came for me earlier than I expected. By the time I turned 18, I was desperate to leave home, desperate to build a version of myself that didn't exist in comparison to my sister. For years, my identity had been defined by her glow and my shadow, by her applause and my silence. I craved space, not just physical distance, but the freedom to discover who I might become if I wasn't constantly standing next to her. Leaving for college was my escape. While Emily stayed close to home, basking in the same circle of admirers who had adored her since childhood, I packed my life into 2 suitcases and moved across the state. It wasn't glamorous. I didn't have the luxury of support, financial or emotional. I worked part-time jobs, took on student loans, and spent long nights studying in the library while others were at parties. It was exhausting, but it was also the first time I began to feel like my life was mine. In those years, I found strength in solitude. I learned that independence could be lonely, but it was also liberating. For once, I wasn't measured against Emily. I wasn't compared, overshadowed, or silenced. I could simply exist as Claire, the young woman who loved literature, who excelled in her studies, who began to find her own place in the world. Meanwhile, Emily's life unfolded on a completely different path. Social media became her stage. Every photo she posted was met with adoration, the perfect hair, the perfect outfits, the endless line of friends at her side. From a distance, I watched her craft an image that was flawless, enviable, untouchable. To our parents, she was still the golden child, the proof that they had raised someone extraordinary. I knew better. I knew that beneath the polish, Emily carried secrets, recklessness, mistakes, truths she buried with charm and distraction. But even as I worked to build my own life, I couldn't entirely escape the weight of comparison. My parents still mentioned her in every phone call, their voices filled with pride, as though Emily's accomplishments were extensions of their own. They asked about me too, but never with the same excitement. My steady progress, scholarships, internships, small victories that I cherished, seemed insignificant compared to her glow. I learned to expect little from them, and in doing so, I hardened myself against disappointment. After college, I moved into a small apartment in the city. It wasn't much. Peeling paint on the walls, secondhand furniture, a constant hum of traffic outside my window. But it was mine. That space became my sanctuary, a place where I could breathe without judgment, where I could surround myself with books, plants, and the quiet stability I had always craved. I began teaching, a career that gave me purpose, even if it didn't come with wealth or prestige. Standing in front of a classroom, guiding young minds, reminded me that impact wasn't always measured in applause. Sometimes it was measured in the silence of a student finally understanding something they thought was beyond their reach. Emily, on the other hand, leaned deeper into performance. She built a life around being seen, admired, envied. While I was paying rent with modest paychecks, she was posting photos of weekend trips, new clothes, fancy dinners. I knew not all of it was real. I knew some of it was borrowed, fabricated, or exaggerated. But perception was her currency, and she spent it freely. Our parents never questioned it. They only saw what she allowed them to see, and it was enough to keep her crown polished. The divide between us grew wider with every passing year. Phone calls became rare, visits even rarer. When we did see each other, the tension was palpable. though unspoken. I had stopped expecting warmth, and she had stopped pretending to offer it. We existed like two planets orbiting the same sun, connected only by the family we shared, yet never colliding. Still, I carried my secret, the wound that had shaped me, the one that Emily eventually used as a weapon. I had spent years working through the pain in private, through therapy, through writing, through the slow, quiet work of healing. But I never spoke of it aloud to family. I didn't trust them to hold it with care. That silence became both a shield and a prison. It protected me from exposure, but it also isolated me. I lived with the fear that one day it might be dragged into the light, that one day someone would decide it was theirs to reveal. Emily was the last person I expected to do it, yet in hindsight, maybe it was inevitable. She had always thrived on power, always needed to be the center of attention. What better way to command a room than to strip me bare in front of it? What better way to remind everyone of her dominance than to reduce me to my most vulnerable truth? Before that night arrived, though, life carried on in its usual rhythm. I kept working, kept building a modest life defined not by extravagance, but by meaning. My friends became my chosen family, people who saw me without the weight of comparison. My students became reminders that what I offered mattered, and yet the shadow of Emily never fully disappeared. Her presence lingered in holiday gatherings, in family updates, in the unspoken hierarchy that always placed her above me. By the time my 32nd birthday approached, I wasn't expecting much. A simple dinner, some cake, polite conversation, nothing extraordinary. My parents insisted on hosting as they had in years past. Against my instincts, I agreed, hoping perhaps that adulthood had softened some of the old patterns. Perhaps things would feel different now. Perhaps I would be seen for more than what I lacked. But I should have known better. Families don't shed their dynamics so easily. The stage had been set long before, and Emily had always known how to play her part. That night would not be a celebration. It would be a reckoning. And though I didn't know it yet, the years I had spent quietly collecting truths would finally matter. Because while Emily thought she held the power, while she believed her words could destroy me, I had something she didn't. A recording, a confession, a truth that was hers, not mine. And when the moment came, when she exposed me to the world, she had no idea that I was ready to expose her in return. The week leading up to my birthday carried a weight I couldn't shake. Birthdays had always been complicated for me, tangled between the desire to be celebrated and the fear of being overshadowed or ignored. Growing up, I had learned to lower my expectations, to accept that the attention would inevitably drift toward my sister, even on the days meant to belong to me. Still, each year, a small part of me hoped for something different. At 32, I should have outgrown those hopes. And yet, when my parents insisted on hosting a dinner for me, I agreed. Perhaps it was habit, perhaps politeness, or perhaps a lingering desire to finally be seen. Their house hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same walls, the same furniture, the same photographs frozen in time. Walking through the front door always felt like stepping into a preserved version of the past, where the roles we had been assigned as children still clung to us. No matter how much I had grown or changed, the house seemed determined to remind me of the hierarchy that had been built long before adulthood. I arrived early that day, partly out of obligation, partly out of the need to ground myself before everyone else appeared. The air was filled with the faint aroma of food being prepared, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the hum of voices as relatives moved through the rooms. My mother, as always, was orchestrating everything, ensuring that the evening would appear flawless on the surface. That was her way. Appearances mattered, and she would never allow cracks to show, even if the foundation underneath was unstable. The dining table had been set with the good china, pieces reserved for holidays and special occasions. Silverware gleamed under the overhead light. Crystal glasses sparkled as though waiting to be filled with wine and laughter. The perfection of it all felt almost mocking. Beneath the polished presentation, I knew the currents of our family ran far darker. Guests began arriving one by one, their coats hung neatly in the foyer, their voices filling the air with the familiar buzz of small talk. My relatives greeted me with polite smiles, perfunctory congratulations, and the kind of comments that skimmed the surface without ever touching the depths of who I really was. They didn't ask about my work, my passions, or the life I had built for myself. They asked about the weather, about the city traffic, about anything that kept the conversation safe and shallow. It was easier that way, I suppose. Easier to keep me in the role they had always assigned me, the quiet one, the dependable one, the one who was never quite enough to deserve more than polite acknowledgement. Emily arrived later, as expected, stepping into the house with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. She always did. The room seemed to brighten when she entered, not because of light, but because people responded to her as though they couldn't help themselves. Compliments flowed in her direction effortlessly. She basked in them, offering smiles and laughter that seemed genuine to everyone else, but felt calculated to me. Watching her, I felt the same quiet sting I had carried since childhood. The reminder that, even on my birthday, she would find a way to stand at the center. Dinner began with the usual rituals. My father sat at the head of the table, his posture still carrying authority even though the years had softened him. My mother floated between seats, ensuring that everyone's plates were full, her eyes constantly scanning the room for any sign of imperfection. The conversation started with lightness. Stories about work, updates on children, the safe rhythm of family gatherings. I participated where I could, but my words often dissolved into the noise. The attention, as always, tilted toward Emily. She had mastered the art of storytelling, weaving even the most mundane experiences into something worth applause. I sat across from her, my presence quiet, my thoughts louder than the words I spoke aloud. There was something in the air that night, though, something I couldn't quite define. A tension humming beneath the surface, waiting. I felt it in the way Emily glanced at me from time to time, her eyes sharp, calculating. I felt it in the way my parents seemed overly invested in keeping the evening cheerful, their laughter just a little too forced. It was as though everyone sensed that the facade was fragile, that the slightest crack could expose something they weren't ready to face. As the courses were served, salad, then the main dishes, then the slow transition into dessert, I felt my chest tighten. Birthdays were supposed to be celebrations, yet the closer we came to the cake, the heavier I felt. Memories of past birthdays played in my mind. The times Emily had stolen the spotlight with an announcement of her own, the times my achievements had been dismissed in favor of her charm. This year felt no different, except for one detail, the secret I carried about her. It rested quietly inside me, unspoken but powerful, waiting for its moment. When the cake finally appeared, glowing with candles, everyone's voices rose in unison. The familiar song filled the room, cheerful and warm on the surface, but suffocating beneath it. I forced a smile, leaned toward the cake, and blew out the candles. The wish I made was the same one I had made since childhood, to be seen, truly seen, for who I was beyond comparison, beyond silence. The room erupted in applause, glasses clinking, voices rising with celebration. For a brief moment, it felt almost real, almost genuine. But then the applause faded, and I saw Emily lean forward, her posture poised, her eyes gleaming with something that felt less like affection and more like anticipation. She was waiting for her moment. I didn't know exactly what she would do, but I knew her well enough to sense it. Emily never allowed me to hold the spotlight for long. And on this night, the stage was set perfectly for her. The audience was ready, the attention was fixed, and all she needed was one sentence to shift everything. As I looked around the table, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment I had been invisible played in my mind like a montage. I had carried my own wounds in silence, building strength in the shadows, believing that one day it would matter. And now, as Emily prepared to expose me, I realized that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply sat there, waiting, bracing myself for the words I knew would cut through the room like a blade. Because while Emily thought she was about to destroy me, she had no idea that I was ready for her. The recording, the truth I had kept locked away, was mine to use. And when the time came, when her cruelty unveiled my secret, hers would follow. The air felt electric, heavy with anticipation. Something was about to break. And when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. The moment arrived with a suddenness that still echoes in my memory. One instant, the room was filled with the remnants of laughter and the clinking of glasses after the cake had been served. The next, the air shifted, sharp and tense, as my sister leaned forward in her chair. I recognized the look on her face before she even opened her mouth. The same look I had seen countless times in childhood, the one she wore when she was about to take something that wasn't hers to claim. Her voice cut across the room, silencing the conversations around the table. In an instant, every pair of eyes shifted toward her, then toward me. And then, with a casual cruelty she had perfected over the years, she spoke words I had feared for as long as I could remember. My secret, the wound I had carried in silence, was no longer mine. She had stripped it bare, offering it to the room like it was gossip meant to entertain. The silence that followed was louder than any sound I had ever known. Faces shifted uncomfortably, forks paused in midair, glasses lowered quietly to the table. The warmth of celebration dissolved into the heavy weight of judgment, pity, and confusion. I sat frozen, my body stiff, my mind racing but unable to land anywhere. In that instant, I became smaller than I had ever been, reduced to the very thing I had worked so hard to rise above. The betrayal was not just in her words, but in the way she delivered them. With a smile that masked the venom, with a tone that suggested she was unveiling something for the good of others, as if my private pain was hers to control. It was a performance, and the audience was captivated, not because they wanted to be, but because they didn't know where else to look. Shame wrapped itself around me like a second skin. It crawled through my veins, hot and suffocating, pulling me back to the countless nights I had sat alone with this secret, believing that if I kept it buried deeply enough, it would no longer define me. Yet here I was, exposed in the most public way possible, stripped of control. My breath felt shallow, my chest tight, as though I had been forced into a spotlight I never asked for. In those endless seconds, I wanted to disappear. I wanted the floor to swallow me whole, to release me from the weight of every gaze that had fallen upon me. I had feared this moment for years, imagined it in nightmares, and now that it was real, it felt almost surreal. The sounds around me seemed muted, the world narrowing to the pounding of my own heartbeat. But beneath the suffocating shame, another truth stirred. A quiet strength I had built over years of surviving, of carrying this weight alone. Emily believed she had destroyed me, believed that her words would crush whatever dignity I had managed to preserve. What she didn't know was that I had prepared for this moment, even if I hadn't realized it fully until now. The recording I carried, her secret, pulsed in my mind like a lifeline. For months, maybe longer, I had wondered if I would ever need it, if I would ever have the courage to use it. Now, as the room simmered with silent judgment, I knew the answer. Emily had chosen this battlefield, but she had no idea that she had brought me to it armed. Still, I didn't move. Not yet. My instinct was to remain still, to absorb the moment fully, to let her believe she had won. The room needed to sit with what she had done, needed to feel the weight of her cruelty before I shifted the balance. I stared down at my plate, not because I was broken, but because I understood the power of silence. It unsettled people more than anger, more than defense. My stillness created questions, questions that would soon turn toward her. Around me, the whispers began. Some voices carried pity, others disbelief, some the faint trace of judgment I had always feared. My mother avoided my eyes. My father's expression hardened into the same unreadable mask he had worn my entire life. Relatives shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable, unsure of what to say. Emily sat tall, her posture triumphant, the corners of her mouth betraying satisfaction. She thought she had ended me. What she didn't realize was that she had freed me. For so long, I had lived in fear of this very moment, convinced that exposure would destroy me. Yet as I sat there, raw and humiliated, I felt something unexpected. The worst had happened. The secret was no longer hidden. The shame I had carried in silence was now visible, and though it cut deeply, it also lifted something from my shoulders. Emily had turned my pain into a weapon, but in doing so, she had also revealed her own cruelty for everyone to see. I realized then that she had underestimated me. She thought my silence was weakness, that my invisibility meant I would never fight back. What she didn't know was that strength can be built in shadows, forged in the quiet resilience of surviving what others can't see, and now that strength was mine to use. The recording I held onto wasn't just revenge, it was truth. Her truth. A truth that would shatter the image she had so carefully crafted, the image everyone else still believed in. If she thought my secret could destroy me, she had no idea how devastating hers would be when revealed. The night had shifted irreversibly. The celebration was gone, replaced by tension that lingered in every glance, every breath. Emily sat at the center, believing she had secured her power once again. And I sat across from her, silent but steady, knowing that her triumph was temporary. Because when I chose to press play, when her words spilled into the room for everyone to hear, it would no longer be me under the weight of judgment. It would be her. And unlike me, she had never learned how to live in shadows. The silence that followed Emily's revelation stretched across the room like a suffocating blanket. It was not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the heavy, unrelenting quiet of judgment. Every person at the table seemed frozen, their faces shifting between discomfort, disbelief, and the kind of pity that burns more than anger ever could. I sat perfectly still, though inside I was unraveling. The weight of every gaze pressed against me, my skin hot, my heart pounding, my breath shallow. Shame has a way of distorting time. Seconds feel like hours, and the space around you blurs until all you can sense is the heat of humiliation. I had imagined this moment countless times, in nightmares that woke me in the middle of the night, in daydreams where I rehearsed responses I never actually gave. But imagination could not have prepared me for the rawness of reality. I felt smaller than ever, exposed in a way that made me ache from the inside out. It was not only the betrayal of my secret that stung, but the betrayal of being robbed of the choice to share it on my own terms. It was mine, my story, my wound. And yet Emily had claimed it, packaged it as entertainment, and delivered it to an audience who had no right to it. As I scanned the room through lowered lashes, I noticed the fractures spreading. My mother's hands twisted in her lap, her eyes fixed firmly on the table as though staring hard enough might erase what had just been said. My father's jaw tightened, his face a mask of unreadable rigidity, the same mask he had worn my entire life whenever emotions threatened to break through. My relatives fidgeted with their glasses, cleared their throats, shifted in their chairs. No one spoke. The silence itself became its own kind of verdict. Emily sat tall, her satisfaction poorly hidden behind a veil of casualness. Her posture said everything, that she believed she had once again secured control, that she had re-established herself as the one who held power in our family dynamic. She had not simply exposed me, she had claimed victory. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that her moment of triumph had planted the seed of her undoing. I remained silent, not out of weakness, but out of calculation. In my stillness, the room turned inward. My relatives avoided my eyes, but in their avoidance, they revealed their discomfort. They were not proud of what she had done. They might have been captivated, but they were unsettled too, Cruelty, when displayed so openly, has a way of staining the one who wields it. I could feel the tension ripple outward. The conversations that had once filled the room with shallow laughter and polite chatter had vanished. In their place was a suffocating weight, a collective awareness that something irreversible had just happened. No one reached for dessert anymore. No one lifted their glasses. The evening had fractured, and everyone sat trapped in the sharp edges of it. Inside, I was caught between devastation and clarity. Yes, the humiliation burned, but beneath it was an unexpected freedom. The secret was no longer mine to guard, no longer a shadow I had to carry alone. She had weaponized it, but in doing so, she had exposed her own cruelty as much as my pain. For years, I had lived in fear of this moment, certain it would destroy me. Yet here I was, still breathing, still present, still intact despite the shame pressing against me. That realization gave me strength. It reminded me of what I carried, the recording, the undeniable truth of Emily's own darkness. I thought of it not as revenge, but as balance. She had taken something from me, but she had her own secrets too. Secrets she would never want to see the light of day. And unlike me, she wasn't prepared to survive exposure. The night stretched painfully, each minute an echo of what had happened. People tried to resume conversation, but their voices faltered, their words stilted. The rhythm of celebration was gone, replaced by a tension that clung to every corner of the room. My relatives avoided looking at me directly, though I could feel their eyes flicker toward me when they thought I wasn't watching. I had become both invisible and hypervisible all at once, unseen for who I truly was, but scrutinized for what they had just learned. Emily, for her part, seemed to thrive in the aftermath. She carried herself with an ease that suggested she believed she had won. She laughed a little louder, smiled a little wider, filling the silence with her performance. But beneath her composure, I noticed the flicker of something else, the faint glimmer of nerves. She knew me well enough to know I didn't break easily. She knew my silence wasn't always surrender. I let the night unfold without resistance, holding myself steady even as the shame lingered. I absorbed it, let it run its course through my body, but I did not let it consume me. I had lived through worse. I had carried this secret for years, and though it was no longer hidden, it no longer held the same power over me. Emily had thought she was delivering a final blow. What she had really done was open the door for me to release what I had been holding all along. By the time the evening drew to a close, the atmosphere in the house had shifted permanently. The lightness of the party had been replaced with something brittle and uncomfortable. Guests departed more quickly than usual, their polite goodbyes laced with unease. My parents avoided my gaze, their silence as telling as any words could have been. Emily remained radiant, but her glow felt forced, brittle at the edges, as though she knew the ground beneath her was not as solid as she wanted it to appear. I left that night carrying more than I had arrived with. I carried the humiliation, yes, but I also carried the clarity that came with surviving what I had feared most, and I carried the knowledge that Emily's turn was coming. Her secret was safe for the moment, but it wouldn't remain that way forever. That night, as I lay awake replaying the scene over and over, I realized something profound. Families build hierarchies around silence and appearances. I had been assigned the role of the quiet one, the overlooked one, the one meant to carry my pain unseen. Emily had been given the crown, celebrated for her shine, excused for her cruelty. But in exposing me, she had disrupted that fragile balance. For the first time, the cracks in our family's facade were visible to everyone. And for the first time, I held the power to decide what came next. The drive home that night felt endless, though the streets were nearly empty. The silence inside my car pressed down heavier than the silence that had filled my parents' dining room just hours before. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached, yet I barely felt it. My body moved on autopilot, while my mind replayed the scene over and over, as if forcing me to relive the humiliation in slow motion. The glow of the candles, the forced smiles of my family, the sound of Emily's voice as she peeled back the layer of my privacy. Each image returned sharper than before. I had imagined this moment countless times, always as the end of something, always as the point where my life collapsed under the weight of exposure. And yet, as I drove through the quiet streets, headlights carving through the darkness, I realized I was still intact. Bruised, yes. Shaken, certainly, but intact. When I reached my apartment, I moved through it like a stranger. The space that had always been my refuge felt altered, tainted by the echoes of the night. I set my keys on the counter, sat on the edge of my bed, still in the same clothes, and let the silence wash over me. The pain came in waves, shame, anger, disbelief, but underneath it all was a current I hadn't expected: clarity. Emily had done exactly what I had always feared, and yet the world had not ended. My chest still rose and fell with breath. My life, though shaken, still belonged to me. What she had taken was my privacy, but what remained was my resilience. The fear that had governed me for years had been realized, and now, stripped bare, I could see that it did not hold the power I once believed. In the days that followed, the fallout began quietly. Phone calls from relatives came, each carrying a different tone. Some were heavy with pity, others with the kind of curiosity that borders on gossip. A few said nothing at all, their silence more telling than words could ever be. My parents reached out briefly, not with comfort, but with vague, careful remarks meant to smooth over what could not be undone. Their focus, as always, seemed more on preserving appearances than on acknowledging the damage done. At work, I felt the weight of being observed. My students, too young to fully understand but perceptive enough to sense change, studied me with cautious eyes. Colleagues glanced at me in passing, their expressions unreadable, though I imagined whispers had already begun to circulate. Secrets, once exposed, have a way of spreading beyond the walls where they were first revealed. Through it all, Emily remained silent. No apology, no acknowledgement, no message of remorse. Her silence was louder than her words had been, a silence that carried the smug assurance of someone who believed she had won. For her, the evening had been a performance, and she had taken the lead role with ease. What she didn't realize was that her performance had left cracks not only in me, but in the way others now saw her. I began to notice it in small ways. Relatives who had once leaned toward her now pulled back slightly, their admiration dimmed by the harshness of what they had witnessed. Neighbors who had once spoken of her glow now mentioned her cruelty in hushed tones. It wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was there, the quiet erosion of the image she had spent years crafting. And through it all, I held the recording. I hadn't listened to it since the night I had captured it, but I knew every word contained in its digital memory. Her voice, her confession, her truth. For weeks, I had debated what to do with it, whether it was right to keep it, whether it was dangerous to use it. Now, after the humiliation she had dealt me, I saw it differently. It was no longer just evidence. It was balance. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. Part of me wanted to act immediately, to restore what she had taken by exposing her in turn. But another part of me knew that timing mattered. Silence, when used with intention, carried power. Just as it had unsettled the room when I refused to respond, it unsettled her now. She had struck her blow, but my lack of reaction left her waiting for a counter she couldn't predict. Nights stretched long as I lay awake, the replay of her betrayal merging with the possibilities of what I could do. My journals filled with reflections, not only on her cruelty, but on my own strength, on the years I had spent building resilience without realizing it. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. Emily believed exposure was the end, but for me, it was a beginning. Each day, I grew a little steadier. The shame that had felt suffocating began to loosen its grip. I walked through the halls of my school with a straighter spine. I answered calls from relatives with calm composure. I moved through the world knowing that I had survived the thing I feared most. And beneath it all, the recording remained a steady hum, a reminder that my silence was not weakness, but choice. The immediate aftermath of the dinner was not the collapse I had once dreaded. It was transformation. It forced me to face the fragility of reputation, the cruelty of family dynamics, and the truth that survival is not about being untouched, but about continuing despite the scars. Emily had exposed me. But in doing so, she had also revealed herself. And while she basked in the temporary glow of her victory, I carried something she could never take: the power of truth waiting patiently to be set free. That knowledge sustained me in the days and weeks that followed. It reminded me that though she had written the first act of this story, I still held the ending. And when the time came, when I chose to let her words speak for themselves, the world would see her not as the radiant sister she pretended to be, but as the reflection of what she truly was. For now, I waited. Because sometimes the most powerful act is not to strike back immediately, but to let silence grow heavy, to let anticipation gnaw, to let those who thought they had won begin to feel the ground shift beneath them. The night of my birthday had not been the ending Emily wanted it to be. It was the start of something far more powerful. In the weeks that followed my birthday, the ripple effects of that evening began to spread beyond the walls of my parents' dining room. Secrets, once exposed, have a way of traveling quickly, slipping into conversations where they don't belong, carried by whispers that move faster than truth. What Emily had revealed was no longer confined to the family. It leaked into the social fabric around us, the neighbors, the community, the people who thought they knew who I was. I noticed it first in the way people looked at me. At the grocery store, familiar faces lingered a little too long, their expressions shifting from polite recognition to cautious curiosity. At work, colleagues greeted me with smiles that didn't reach their eyes, their questions carefully worded but laced with the knowledge of what they had heard. Even strangers seemed to carry an air of knowing, as though my private pain had been transformed into public consumption. The humiliation was sharp at first, like stepping into cold water. Every glance felt like confirmation that I had been reduced to nothing more than the secret Emily had exposed. I braced myself each morning before leaving my apartment, preparing for the possibility of pity or judgment in every encounter. The world outside, once indifferent to my presence, now seemed to see me too clearly, but only through the lens of my sister's cruelty. And yet, beneath the sting of exposure, I felt something shifting. I was no longer living in fear of the moment when my secret would be revealed. It had already happened. The worst had unfolded, and still, I was standing. The anticipation was gone, replaced by the steady reality of survival. That change, subtle as it was, began to harden me in ways I hadn't expected. Emily, for her part, seemed to thrive in the beginning. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed she had reclaimed control, striding through social circles with her usual glow, her laughter louder than ever. She leaned into the role of the favored daughter, the admired sister, the woman untouched by consequence. But as the weeks passed, the cracks began to show. People had seen her cruelty. They might not have said it aloud, but they had witnessed it. The sharpness of her words, the ease with which she exposed someone she claimed to love. For years, she had hidden behind charm, masking her selfishness beneath a practiced smile. But now, that mask was thinner. In subtle ways, I began to notice the shift. Relatives who once clung to her stories now hesitated. Neighbors who once praised her began to keep their distance. Admiration gave way to suspicion, though no one dared to confront her directly. The recording weighed heavily in my mind during those weeks. Her secret, her truth, stored securely in a device that fit in the palm of my hand. I hadn't listened to it again, but I didn't need to. I knew every word, every inflection of her voice, every admission she never wanted the world to hear. The temptation to release it was strong, especially as I watched her walk freely while I bore the burden of her betrayal. But something held me back. Not fear, but strategy. timing mattered. I had learned that silence could be more unsettling than immediate retaliation. The more I waited, the more restless she seemed to become. Though she never acknowledged it outright, I could sense her awareness of my silence. She knew me well enough to understand that I was not someone who forgot, not someone who surrendered easily. My lack of reaction must have unnerved her, even if she never showed it. Each time our paths crossed, family gatherings, accidental encounters in town, she carried herself with forced ease, her laughter too loud, her smile too bright. Beneath it, I saw the flicker of unease. Meanwhile, I focused on reclaiming control of my own life. At work, I poured myself into teaching, refusing to let whispers define me. My students became my anchor, their progress a reminder that I mattered in ways that had nothing to do with the secrets others carried. I walked into each classroom with a renewed sense of purpose, determined not to be reduced to the version of myself Emily had exposed. In the community, I learned to face the stares without shrinking. I carried myself taller, not because I felt unscathed, but because I had survived. Each glance, each whisper became less powerful over time, their sting dulled by repetition. What had once felt unbearable became manageable. In some strange way, I had grown accustomed to being seen through the lens of my pain. And because of that, I began to realize that their perception no longer controlled me. The more I reclaimed my space, the more Emily's shine dimmed. People began to notice the imbalance, the cruelty beneath her charm. It wasn't dramatic, not a sudden collapse, but a quiet erosion of her influence. The same relatives who once adored her now looked at her differently, their admiration tinged with caution. The neighbors who once hung on her every word now spoke of her with suspicion. The facade she had built over years was weakening, piece by piece. And I knew, when the time came, the recording would be the final blow. But I wasn't ready yet. I wanted the erosion to continue, the cracks to widen, the foundation to weaken. Releasing the truth too soon would have felt like desperation. Waiting, allowing the silence to do its work, meant that when the moment finally came, it would not just expose her, it would dismantle her entirely. So I waited, and I watched. Each day I grew stronger in the shadow of her betrayal, while she grew weaker beneath the weight of her own lies. The balance of power, once so firmly in her grasp, was shifting. Slowly, quietly, inevitably. By the end of that winter, the community no longer saw me only as the sister with a secret. They saw me as someone who had endured, who had survived something cruel and still stood. And they saw Emily as someone different too, not just the golden child, but the one who had wielded cruelty without hesitation. Her glow no longer blinded them. The cracks in her image were becoming impossible to ignore, and I knew, when the time was right, I would no longer be silent. As winter gave way to the first quiet signs of spring, I realized something had shifted inside me. For months I had lived under the shadow of Emily's betrayal, carrying the weight of her words and the endless echoes of whispers in my community. But now, as the air softened and the days grew longer, I began to notice that the burden felt lighter. Not because the whispers had stopped, they hadn't, but because I had learned to carry them differently. Pain, when lived with long enough, becomes a kind of armor. I no longer flinched at the sideways glances or the half-spoken comments. Instead, I began to see them as proof that I had endured something many others could not have faced. They did not break me. They reminded me that I was still standing. The more I carried the weight, the stronger I became beneath it. In those months, I turned inward. My apartment, once a space where I collapsed in exhaustion after long days, became a sanctuary where I pieced myself back together. I filled the silence with books that challenged me, journals that absorbed my thoughts, and long walks where I could think without interruption. Slowly, I began to rebuild my sense of self, not the fragile version Emily had shattered, but something stronger, steadier, and harder to dismantle. The recording remained in my possession, untouched but never forgotten. It was a quiet promise, resting in the background of my life, reminding me that I held the power to shift the narrative whenever I chose. For a long time, I thought about it daily, my mind circling back to the moment when I would finally unleash it. But as the weeks stretched on, I found myself thinking about it less as a weapon and more as insurance. Knowing it was there gave me control. I didn't need to act immediately because the mere knowledge of it created balance. It allowed me to breathe, to focus not only on revenge, but also on recovery. And recovery, I discovered, was not about erasing the wound. It was about accepting it and choosing to grow around it. I leaned into my work with renewed energy, pouring myself into my students, into projects that demanded creativity and resilience. Their small victories became my fuel, each lesson a reminder that I mattered in ways Emily could never touch. Within those walls, my secret was irrelevant. I was not the sister who had been betrayed. I was the teacher, the guide, the person shaping futures. That role grounded me in a way nothing else could. Beyond work, I began to nurture other parts of myself that I had long neglected. I returned to painting, something I had abandoned years ago, and found solace in the quiet stroke of brushes against canvas. Colors spilled across the page, unshaped at first, then slowly forming patterns that reflected the emotions I couldn't always put into words. There was anger in those strokes, yes, but also hope, resilience, and the beginnings of forgiveness, not for Emily, but for myself. Forgiveness for allowing her cruelty to define me for as long as it did. The more I grew, the more I began to notice Emily shrinking. Not in appearance, she still carried herself with the same polish, the same carefully constructed image, but in influence. The admiration she had once commanded effortlessly now seemed forced, sustained only by habit rather than genuine respect. People no longer saw her the same way. Her betrayal had revealed something about her that couldn't be unseen, no matter how hard she tried to cover it. And the silence with which I carried myself, the refusal to collapse under her cruelty, only amplified the contrast between us. Still, I knew this journey wasn't just about waiting for her downfall. It was about preparing myself for the moment when the truth would finally come to light. Not just the truth about me, but the truth about her. If I were to reveal what I held, it couldn't come from a place of bitterness alone. It had to come from strength, from a place where I no longer needed revenge to validate me. That realization was perhaps the most important of all, because it meant that when the moment finally arrived, I would not be acting out of desperation, but out of clarity. I would be showing the world who Emily truly was, but more importantly, I would be showing myself who I had become. By the middle of spring, I noticed that the whispers had changed. Where once they carried the sting of gossip, they now carried curiosity, even admiration. People began to recognize that I had endured something that might have destroyed another person, and yet I was still standing, stronger than before. Slowly, I was being seen not as the sister with the secret, but as the woman who had survived betrayal with quiet resilience. And Emily? She felt it. I could see it in her eyes during the rare family gatherings we shared. She laughed a little too loudly, spoke a little too confidently, as though volume could cover the truth. But behind it all, there was a flicker of unease. She knew I still had what she feared most. She knew the silence wasn't surrender. It was waiting. I often thought about timing, about when the perfect moment would come to release her truth. But the more I thought about it, the more I understood that the perfect moment wasn't something I could plan. It would reveal itself, just as clearly as the betrayal had revealed itself on my birthday, and when it came, I would be ready. Not because I needed revenge to heal, but because I had already healed enough to act with purpose. By the time summer approached, I no longer felt like a victim of Emily's cruelty. I felt like someone transformed, someone tempered by fire. The secret was no longer a cage around me. It was a choice, resting in my hands, waiting for the moment when it would finally set me free. The night of my birthday still lingers in my memory like a scar that has healed but will never truly fade. What my sister tried to do that evening was designed to crush me, to humiliate me in front of everyone I cared about, and to cement herself as the one with control. Instead, it became the defining moment of my life, the instant when I finally realized I no longer had to live in anyone's shadow. For years, I had allowed my family to shape who I was. Their judgments, their whispers, their constant comparisons had become part of my inner voice. I convinced myself that maybe they were right, maybe I would never be enough, maybe silence was the only safe way to exist. But that night changed everything. When she exposed my secret, she thought she had buried me. What she didn't realize was that she had also unlocked a strength inside me that had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to emerge. The days following that birthday were not easy. The room had fallen silent after I played her recording, but silence does not mean peace. Silence can carry weight, the kind that follows you home, echoes through your sleep, and forces you to confront everything you have avoided for years. My family's reactions ranged from shock to anger to disappointment, but I understood something then that I had never grasped before. Their reactions were no longer my responsibility. I had lived too long believing I had to carry their expectations. That belief ended the moment I pressed play. I began to rebuild my life slowly, carefully, and with intention. I no longer accepted being the person people could mock, control, or dismiss. I started speaking up in ways I never had before. I said no when I needed to. I set boundaries and I held them firmly. For the first time, I became protective of my own heart, refusing to let guilt or manipulation guide me anymore. My sister's attempt at humiliation had, in a strange and twisted way, freed me. There were moments when the pain returned in waves. I would wake in the middle of the night replaying the look on people's faces, the way the room had turned heavy with judgment, the sting of betrayal so raw it seemed to cut deeper each time I remembered it. But slowly, the weight began to shift. The shame was no longer mine to carry. What happened to me that night was not proof of my weakness, it was proof of my resilience. In the months after, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I stood taller, I spoke louder, I trusted my own instincts without looking for validation from others. And in doing so, I began to see opportunities I had once been too afraid to chase. I applied for roles I had previously thought I wasn't good enough for. I met people who respected me not for what they thought I should be, but for who I truly was. I found joy in small moments because I finally knew they belonged to me, not borrowed from someone else's approval. My relationship with my sister shifted too. The balance of power was gone. She had tried to wield control over me through secrets, but secrets lose their power when exposed. For the first time, she had to face her own reflection in the same way she forced me to face mine. Whether or not she ever learned from it was out of my hands, and that realization was liberating. I no longer needed her apology to heal. My healing came from within. As I look back now, I realize that the story was never just about betrayal. It was about transformation. Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones that reveal the strongest parts of us. My sister tried to define me with humiliation, but I defined myself with resilience. She gave me the chance to show the world, and myself, that I could rise above even the sharpest attempt to tear me down. And so, my life is different now. Not because I erased the past, but because I embraced it as the beginning of something greater. My worth is not tied to my family's approval, to whispered secrets, or to the narratives others tried to write for me. My worth is mine alone. My voice is mine alone. And no one can take that away from me again. If you are listening to this right now, know this. You are stronger than the secrets others try to hold against you. You are braver than the judgments spoken about you. And you are more powerful than the shame someone else wants you to carry. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments, especially where in the world you are watching from. Your voice matters, and I would love to hear your story too. Because in the end, the real measure of strength is not found in hiding or pretending. It is found in standing tall, telling your truth, and reminding the world and yourself that no one can silence who you are meant to be.